I laughed at my fiancé's face after I caught him cheating. My mother thinks I completely lost it. I'd been with Brandon for 6 years and we were supposed to get married in 4 months when everything went sideways. We'd built this whole life together with our townhouse and our shared friend group, and even a joint checking account for wedding expenses. I worked at a marketing firm downtown, and Brandon was a personal trainer at a high-end gym, and honestly, we had it pretty good. My mom absolutely loved Brandon and kept calling him her future son and telling everyone how lucky I was to have found someone so committed and stable. She'd already bought her mother of the bride dress and would send me wedding planning articles every single day. Brandon was always super attentive, picking me up from work when it rained, making my protein shakes every morning, and constantly posting about how he couldn't wait to marry me. Then 3 weeks ago, I came home early from a canceled client meeting and found Brandon in our bed with Megan from my office. Not just any coworker, but the woman who sat next to me every day and had helped me pick out my wedding dress. They were so caught up, they didn't even hear me come in until I was standing in the doorway. Brandon jumped up trying to cover himself while Megan grabbed her clothes and ran to the bathroom, and that's when I started laughing. Not crying, not screaming, just genuine deep belly laughter that wouldn't stop. Brandon stood there naked and confused, asking if I was okay, and I just kept laughing harder. Megan came out of the bathroom half-dressed and asked if I was having a breakdown, and that made me laugh even more. I laughed so hard I had to sit on the floor. They both just stared at me like I'd lost my mind, and honestly, the looks on their faces made it even funnier. Brandon tried to explain that it wasn't what it looked like, which sent me into another fit of laughter because seriously, what else could it be? He then switched to saying it was a mistake and just happened, which was hilarious because Megan's overnight bag was clearly visible in the corner. After about 10 minutes of me just laughing, they both got dressed and left together, probably thinking I'd completely snapped. My mom called an hour later because Brandon had contacted her saying I'd had some kind of mental break and needed help. She rushed over and found me calmly packing Brandon's stuff into boxes while eating takeout. When I explained what happened, she was horrified that I wasn't devastated and kept asking if I was in shock. I told her I was perfectly fine and she accused me of being in denial. The next day at work was even better. Megan had called in sick, but everyone knew because Brandon had tried to do damage control by telling people I'd gone crazy when I caught them. My coworkers expected me to be destroyed, but I walked in completely normal, brought donuts for everyone, and acted like nothing happened. When people asked if I was okay, I'd just smile and say I'd never been better. My boss pulled me aside concerned about my mental state, and I assured her I was perfectly functional. The real kicker was when Brandon kept texting, asking when we could talk about fixing things. He actually thought we were still getting married. I responded with laughing emojis and nothing else. He showed up at my office begging to discuss our relationship, and I just laughed in his face again. Security had to escort him out while I waved goodbye, still giggling. My mom staged an intervention with my sisters saying I needed therapy because I was clearly having a psychological crisis. They sat me down and said it wasn't normal to react this way to betrayal. That's when I finally explained why I'd been laughing. See, what Brandon didn't know was that I'd been having doubts for months. He was controlling about what I ate, constantly criticizing my friends, and had been pressuring me to quit my job after the wedding to support his fitness influencer dreams. I'd been stressed about how to call off the wedding without devastating my mom, who'd been planning this since I was 12. Then I found out something else Brandon didn't know. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. I pulled out my phone and opened the banking app, turning the screen toward my mom and sisters. The joint wedding account showed a balance of $3,000 when it should have been $18,000. I scrolled through the transactions showing regular withdrawals over the past 4 months, each one labeled as equipment purchases or supplement orders. My mom's face went from confused to shocked as she leaned closer to read the dates and amounts. Alicia grabbed the phone from my hand and started swiping through the statements, her jaw getting tighter with each transaction. Joanne looked over her shoulder and actually gasped when she saw how much money was gone. Brandon had taken $15,000 without telling me, spending it on ring lights and protein powder and camera equipment for his social media accounts that barely had any followers. My mom sat back in her chair looking like someone had punched her in the stomach. Alicia started pacing around the living room asking why I hadn't noticed sooner, and I explained that Brandon handled most of the wedding account deposits since he insisted on being involved in every financial decision. He'd convinced me it showed we were a team, and that couples who managed money together stayed together. The irony of that statement while he was secretly draining our savings made me want to laugh again. Joanne asked if the vendors knew we couldn't pay them, and I told her I'd been calling everyone that morning to explain the situation. The florist had been understanding but needed at least half the deposit to hold our date, which we obviously didn't have anymore. The venue coordinator had been less sympathetic and threatened to keep the entire deposit if we canceled. My mom finally spoke up asking if this was really happening, if her perfect future son actually stole from his own wedding fund. I showed her the receipt I'd found in Brandon's gym bag for a $4,000 camera setup purchased 2 weeks before I caught him cheating. Alicia stopped pacing and announced she was calling her lawyer friend to see what legal options I had for getting the money back. She grabbed her own phone and stepped into the kitchen, already dialing before anyone could respond. Joanne pulled out a notebook and started writing down all the vendors I'd mentioned, asking for their contact information so she could help negotiate payment plans. My mom just sat there staring at the bank statements on my phone, scrolling up and down through the transactions like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. I could see her mentally replaying every conversation she'd had with Brandon about wedding planning, probably wondering how she missed all the signs. Alicia came back from the kitchen saying her lawyer friend wanted copies of everything, and that I definitely had grounds for some kind of legal action. She started taking screenshots of the bank statements and asking me to forward her any emails or texts where Brandon mentioned the wedding account. Joanne called the florist first and explained that my fiancé had stolen the wedding money, which made the florist suddenly much more sympathetic and willing to work with just my portion of the deposit. My mom looked up from the phone and said she'd noticed Brandon seemed stressed about money lately, but assumed it was normal wedding jitters. She admitted he'd asked her for a loan last month, claiming it was for a surprise honeymoon upgrade, and she'd given him $2,000 without telling me. The room went completely silent as we all processed that information. Alicia asked if Mom had gotten that money back, and she shook her head, looking embarrassed. Joanne stopped mid-dial on her phone call and asked how Mom could have given Brandon money without checking with me first. I walked into work the next morning and went straight to the HR office before I could even drop my bag at my desk. Kaya was already there organizing files and looked surprised to see me so early. I closed the door behind me and explained the entire situation with Megan and Brandon, keeping my voice steady even though my hands were shaking slightly. Kaya listened without interrupting, taking notes on her computer and occasionally nodding. She asked if I felt comfortable continuing to work directly next to Megan, and I said absolutely not, that seeing her every day would make it impossible to focus on my job. Kaya pulled up some kind of organizational chart on her screen and started looking at different team configurations. She mentioned that the satellite office across town needed someone with Megan's skills and that a transfer could happen within the week. I felt this huge weight lift off my shoulders, knowing I wouldn't have to sit next to her anymore. Kaya asked if Brandon had been coming to the office, and I told her about security escorting him out 2 days ago. She made another note and said she'd alert building security to not allow him access anymore. The whole meeting took maybe 20 minutes, and Kaya was so professional and efficient that I almost cried from relief. She walked me to my desk and quietly mentioned that several coworkers had expressed concern about the situation, which meant people were being supportive rather than gossipy. I thanked her and sat down at my computer, noticing that Megan's desk next to mine was completely empty. Kaya must have had her clean it out yesterday because there wasn't a single personal item left. Brandon showed up at the townhouse that evening with both his parents, his mom carrying empty boxes and his dad looking extremely uncomfortable. I opened the door before they could knock and stood in the doorway blocking their entrance. Brandon immediately started talking about how we needed to discuss this rationally and that I was overreacting to a simple mistake. His mom tried to push past me, saying they just wanted to collect his belongings peacefully. I held up the folder of printed bank statements I'd prepared specifically for this moment and handed it to Brandon without saying anything. He opened it and his face went completely white as he flipped through the pages. His dad leaned over to see what had caused that reaction and grabbed the folder from Brandon's hands. His mom kept asking what was wrong until his dad showed her the highlighted transactions totaling $15,000. She looked at the papers, then at Brandon, then back at the papers like she couldn't connect the two things together. Brandon tried to explain that he'd planned to pay it all back before the wedding and that he'd needed the equipment to build his brand. His dad cut him off, asking if he seriously stole from his own wedding fund, and Brandon stammered something about it being a temporary loan. His mom's expression shifted from defensive to absolutely horrified as she realized her son had been lying to everyone. She asked me how long I'd known about this, and I explained I'd discovered it the same day I caught him cheating. His dad looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Brandon tried to touch my arm, and I stepped back, telling him not to come any closer. His parents both started apologizing at the same time, talking over each other about how they'd raised him better than this and couldn't believe what he'd done. His mom said they would pay back every single dollar he'd stolen, and his dad was already pulling out his phone to check their bank balance. I told them I appreciated the offer, but everything was going through my lawyer now, and I handed his dad my lawyer's business card. Brandon protested that we didn't need lawyers involved, that we could work this out ourselves like adults. His mom actually shushed him and told him he'd done enough damage already. His dad asked how quickly I needed the money returned, and I said as soon as possible since I had vendors threatening to keep deposits. They both nodded, and his mom wrote down my lawyer's information in her phone. I pointed to the boxes they'd brought and said Brandon could pack his things now while I watched. His mom looked like she wanted to argue, but his dad picked up a box and handed it to Brandon, telling him to get moving. Brandon went upstairs to our bedroom and I followed, standing in the doorway while he grabbed clothes from the closet. He kept trying to start conversations about how we could fix our relationship, and I just stared at him without responding. His parents waited downstairs, and I could hear his mom crying. Brandon filled 4 boxes with his stuff and carried them down one at a time, each trip accompanied by another attempt to talk to me. On his last trip down, he stopped on the stairs and said he never meant to hurt me. I told him he needed to be off the lease by the end of the month, or I'd pursue legal eviction. The next week at work felt completely different without Megan sitting next to me. Her desk stayed empty for 2 days before someone from facilities came and removed it entirely, giving me twice as much space. My coworkers started inviting me to lunch almost every day, and I realized I'd been turning down these invitations for months because Brandon didn't like me eating out without him. He'd always said restaurant food was too unhealthy and that I should bring the meals he prepared for me. On Wednesday, 3 people from my team asked if I wanted to grab coffee, and I said yes without even thinking about it. We spent an hour at the cafe across the street just talking about random stuff that had nothing to do with work or my broken engagement. One of them mentioned a happy hour on Friday, and I agreed to come, remembering how Brandon used to get upset if I went out drinking with coworkers. He'd text me constantly asking when I'd be home and making comments about my alcohol intake. On Thursday, I went to lunch with 2 women from accounting who I'd been friendly with before Brandon started monitoring my friendships. They asked how I was doing and seemed genuinely happy to see me more relaxed. I mentioned how isolated I'd felt, and they both admitted they'd noticed me pulling away over the past year. One of them said she'd wanted to say something but didn't know how to bring it up without seeming nosy. We made plans to start having regular lunch dates, and I felt this warmth in my chest that I hadn't experienced in forever. I met with the wedding planner on Saturday morning at her office downtown. She'd already heard about the situation through the vendor network and had files ready with all our contracts. I expected to feel sad walking through the cancellation process, but instead I felt lighter with each form I signed. She explained which deposits were refundable and which weren't, showing me the breakdown on a spreadsheet. The venue was keeping half our deposit, but returning the other half since we were canceling more than 90 days out. The caterer was keeping everything because of their strict cancellation policy. The florist agreed to return 60% after Joanne's phone call explaining the theft situation. The photographer was the most understanding and offered to return the full deposit minus a small processing fee. When everything was calculated, I'd get back about 40% of what I'd personally contributed. The wedding planner mentioned that combined with the repayment from Brandon's parents, I'd actually come out okay financially. She asked if I was doing all right emotionally, and I told her honestly that I felt relieved more than anything. She smiled and said she'd seen plenty of weddings that should have been canceled, and she was glad I'd figured it out before making a legal commitment. I signed the final cancellation forms and walked out of her office feeling free. My phone buzzed with a text from Brandon's mom saying they'd transferred the full $15,000 to my lawyer's account that morning. Holden called me into his office on Monday afternoon, and I walked in expecting some awkward conversation about my personal life affecting work. Instead, he closed the door and told me to sit down, pulling out a file folder with a major client's logo on it. He explained that they were expanding their account and needed someone to lead the new project team. The position would mean more responsibility, better pay, and direct client interaction. I stared at him confused about why he was telling me this, and he said he was offering me the position. I remembered Brandon pressuring me to turn down a similar opportunity 6 months ago, saying it would take too much time away from wedding planning and our future family. He'd convinced me that being ambitious was selfish when I should be focusing on building our life together. I'd actually withdrawn my name from consideration and watched someone else get the promotion. Holden was watching my face and asked if I was interested. I said yes immediately without even thinking about it. He smiled and said he'd been hoping I'd take it, that I'd been his first choice months ago too. I asked why he was offering it now, and he admitted he'd noticed me seeming more like myself lately. He pulled out the project details and started explaining the timeline and expectations. The work would be challenging and require some late nights, but I felt excited rather than stressed. I realized how much I'd been holding myself back to support Brandon's influencer dreams that were never going to happen. My phone started buzzing constantly that evening with texts from Brandon. The messages had shifted from apologetic to angry, accusing me of ruining his reputation and making it impossible for him to get clients at the gym. He said people were asking questions about why the wedding was canceled, and that my version of events made him look bad. I screenshot every single message and forwarded them to my lawyer's email. He sent another text saying I was destroying his career prospects, and that he'd never be able to build his brand now. I took screenshots of that too. He called 3 times in a row, and I let it go to voicemail each time, saving the recordings where he yelled about me being vindictive and cruel. His final text said I'd regret treating him this way, and that he'd make sure everyone knew what kind of person I really was. I sent everything to my lawyer and then blocked his number entirely. The silence after blocking him felt incredible, like cutting off a source of constant stress I hadn't fully acknowledged. I blocked him on all social media too, not even curious about what he might be posting. My sisters called to check in, and I told them about the promotion and the blocked number. Alicia said she was proud of me for setting boundaries, and Joanne mentioned she'd heard through mutual friends that Brandon was telling people I'd had a breakdown. I didn't care anymore what story he was telling because the people who mattered knew the truth. My mom came over on Tuesday evening with takeout and wine, saying we needed to talk. She sat on my couch and admitted she'd been thinking about everything that happened over the past few weeks. She said she'd noticed Brandon being controlling about small things, but convinced herself it meant he cared about me. The comments about my food choices and friend group had seemed protective rather than restrictive to her. She'd ignored the times he'd interrupted me or made decisions without asking my opinion because she wanted so badly for the relationship to work. My mom started crying, saying she'd been so focused on the wedding she'd planned since I was 12 that she hadn't actually paid attention to whether I was happy. She apologized for the intervention and for making me feel like my reaction to betrayal was wrong. I told her I understood she'd been excited about the wedding, but I needed her to support my actual choices instead of the life she'd imagined for me. She nodded and said she'd been talking to a therapist about her tendency to prioritize appearances over reality. We sat there eating Chinese food and talking honestly for the first time in years. She asked about the new position at work and actually listened when I explained the project details. She mentioned she'd already returned her mother of the bride dress and gotten a full refund. I hugged her and felt our relationship shift into something more genuine and adult. The following Thursday, 3 of my coworkers invited me out for happy hour, and I said yes without checking with anyone first. We went to this bar downtown that had amazing nachos and cheap margaritas. Sarah from accounting ordered a pitcher for the table, and I grabbed a glass without thinking twice about it. Nobody commented on what I was drinking or how much. Nobody suggested I should eat something healthier than fried cheese and guacamole. I ordered a second margarita when the first one was empty, and realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd done that without Brandon making some comment about empty calories, or how alcohol affected my workout performance. The conversation flowed easily between work gossip and weekend plans and terrible dating app stories. Jessica mentioned I seemed different lately, more relaxed somehow. I laughed and said I felt like myself again for the first time in years. She nodded like that made perfect sense and asked if I wanted to join their regular Thursday group. I agreed immediately, and felt this weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized was there. We stayed until almost 9 just talking and laughing, and I drove home feeling genuinely happy instead of anxious about what mood Brandon would be in when I got back. Etienne caught me by the coffee machine on Friday morning and asked if I had time to grab coffee off-site to discuss the new client account. I checked my calendar and we walked to the cafe 2 blocks over. He ordered some complicated latte while I got regular coffee with cream. We sat by the window and he pulled out his tablet with mock-ups for the campaign. His ideas were creative and thoughtful, and he actually listened when I suggested modifications instead of defending his original concepts. Somehow the conversation shifted from work to weekend plans to favorite restaurants to travel dreams. He told me about backpacking through Southeast Asia after college, and I mentioned wanting to visit Iceland someday. He asked what drew me to Iceland specifically, and seemed genuinely interested in my answer about the northern lights and volcanic landscapes. We talked for almost an hour before realizing we both had meetings to get back to. Walking back to the office, he mentioned we should do this again sometime, and I felt this flutter in my chest that I hadn't experienced in years. He was funny without trying too hard, and respectful in a way that felt natural rather than performative. I caught myself smiling at my desk later and realized I was actually attracted to him, which felt both exciting and terrifying. Brandon started texting our mutual friends that weekend saying he was in therapy and wanted to make amends. 3 different people forwarded me screenshots of his messages. He claimed he'd been dealing with personal issues and made terrible choices but was working on himself now. He asked if they could help facilitate a conversation between us so he could apologize properly. I responded to each friend individually, thanking them for letting me know, but explaining I had no interest in communicating with Brandon regardless of his therapy progress. I said I was glad he was getting help, but that didn't change my decision. Each of them replied with supportive messages, and nobody pushed me to reconsider. James said he understood completely, and that Brandon had burned that bridge himself. Lisa mentioned she'd always thought Brandon was too controlling anyway. Their respect for my boundaries without trying to play peacemaker or convince me everyone deserves second chances felt incredibly validating. I blocked the friends who kept forwarding me Brandon's messages because I didn't need those updates in my life anymore. The landlord called on Monday saying he'd reviewed the documentation I provided about the financial theft and Brandon's parents' repayment. He agreed to remove Brandon from the lease effective immediately and waive the usual fees given the circumstances. I thanked him and scheduled the lock change for that same afternoon. The locksmith arrived at 3 and had new keys made within an hour. I tested each lock twice to make sure everything worked properly. Then I called my sisters and asked if they could come over that evening to help rearrange furniture. Alicia and Joanne showed up with wine and takeout. We moved the couch to face the window instead of the TV. We relocated the bookshelf from the bedroom to the living room. We rearranged my bedroom completely so the bed faced a different direction, and the dresser sat where Brandon's desk used to be. Every change made the space feel more like mine and less like ours. We hung new curtains I'd bought online and replaced the throw pillows with ones in colors I actually liked. By 10 that night, the townhouse looked completely different, and I felt this sense of ownership I'd never experienced even when Brandon lived there. My sisters left around 11, and I walked through each room appreciating how the space finally reflected my taste instead of compromises I'd made to keep the peace. Megan's email arrived Tuesday morning with the subject line, "I owe you an apology." I stared at it for several minutes before opening. The message was long and detailed about how she'd been feeling insecure in her own relationship and made terrible choices. She explained that Brandon had pursued her, and she'd been flattered by the attention. She admitted she knew it was wrong but convinced herself it didn't matter because I seemed happy anyway. She wrote that seeing my reaction made her realize how badly she'd betrayed both our friendship and professional relationship. She said she understood if I never forgave her, and that she'd requested the transfer herself because she couldn't face me every day. The apology seemed genuine, and I appreciated the honesty about her motivations. I read it 3 times trying to decide how I felt. Eventually, I closed the email without responding. Forgiving her didn't require reconciliation or even acknowledgement. I simply didn't want her in my life anymore, regardless of how sorry she felt. The anger I'd initially felt had faded into indifference. She'd made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. I archived the email and moved on with my day without giving it another thought. Etienne started joining me for lunch regularly after that first coffee meeting. We'd grab sandwiches from the deli downstairs and eat in the courtyard when weather permitted. The conversation stayed light and easy, ranging from work projects to favorite books to childhood memories. He knew about my broken engagement because office gossip travels fast, but he never pressed for details. He'd make it clear he found me interesting and attractive through small gestures like remembering my coffee order or sending me funny articles he thought I'd enjoy. I found myself looking forward to these lunches and feeling disappointed on days when meetings interfered. The attraction grew steadily, but I stayed cautious, aware that I'd just escaped one relationship and probably shouldn't jump into another immediately. He seemed to understand this without me having to explain it directly. One afternoon, he mentioned he'd wait as long as I needed because some people were worth the patience. I smiled and squeezed his hand across the table, grateful for the space he was giving me to figure out what I actually wanted. My mom called 3 weeks after our honest conversation to say she was planning something special. She showed up Saturday morning with my sisters and a trunk full of decorations. They'd organized a freedom party instead of the wedding I'd canceled. She'd invited close family and friends to celebrate my new beginning. The whole thing was admittedly cheesy, with a banner saying, "Here's to new chapters," and cupcakes decorated with little birds breaking free from cages. But it was also genuinely touching, because everyone there actually supported my happiness instead of mourning the wedding that didn't happen. My aunts brought champagne, and my cousins made a playlist of empowering breakup songs. We spent the evening laughing and dancing and sharing stories about dodging relationship bullets. Several people mentioned they'd had concerns about Brandon, but hadn't known how to voice them. My mom gave a short speech about supporting the lives our children actually want, rather than the ones we imagine for them. I hugged her afterward with tears in my eyes, grateful she'd finally heard me. The party lasted until almost midnight, and I went to bed exhausted but genuinely content. 3 months after catching Brandon with Megan, I was genuinely thriving at work. The new client account had exceeded every projection we'd set. The campaign I'd developed with Etienne's creative team had gone viral in exactly the way we'd hoped. Our client was so pleased they'd already signed on for an extended contract. Holden called me into his office on a Wednesday afternoon, and I assumed it was just another project check-in. Instead, he closed the door and mentioned that a senior marketing director position was opening up next quarter. He said he'd been impressed with my work on the account and wanted to know if I'd be interested in applying. I felt this surge of excitement and immediately said yes. He smiled and pulled out the job description to walk me through the responsibilities and expectations. The role would mean more autonomy, a significant raise, and the chance to lead my own team. I realized that Brandon's plan for me to quit after the wedding would have completely derailed a career I actually loved. Walking back to my desk, I felt grateful for every choice I'd made since that afternoon I'd come home early and found them together. I ran into Brandon at the coffee shop near my office the following week. He was standing in line ahead of me, looking exhausted and defeated. His gym clothes were worn, and he'd lost the polished appearance he used to maintain so carefully. He turned and saw me, and his face went through several emotions before settling on something like shame. He stepped out of line and asked if we could talk for a minute. I glanced at my watch but agreed to 5 minutes. We sat at a corner table, and he explained that his influencer career never took off because brands didn't want to work with someone involved in a cheating scandal. He was working double shifts at the gym trying to pay his parents back the money he'd stolen. He looked genuinely miserable, and part of me felt sorry for him. But mostly, I just felt grateful that I'd escaped before legally binding myself to his poor decisions and lack of integrity. He asked if there was any chance we could try again, and I actually laughed. Not cruelly, but with genuine amusement at the absurdity. I told him I hoped he figured his life out, but I'd moved on completely. I grabbed my coffee and left him sitting there looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. Etienne asked me to dinner that Friday, making it explicitly clear this was a date at an actual restaurant rather than our usual colleague lunches. I said yes without hesitation, feeling excited rather than anxious about the prospect. We went to this Italian place downtown with amazing pasta and wine. The conversation flowed even more easily than usual now that we'd dropped the pretense of this being purely professional friendship. He told me about his family and his dreams of eventually starting his own creative agency. I shared stories about my sisters and my plans for the promotion I was pursuing. He reached across the table and took my hand, asking if this was okay. I nodded and squeezed back, realizing I was finally ready to explore something new with someone who respected rather than controlled me. He walked me to my car afterward and asked permission before kissing me goodnight. The kiss was gentle and respectful, and everything felt right in a way it never had with Brandon. Driving home, I caught myself smiling and felt genuinely optimistic about my future for the first time in years. My sisters came over for brunch the following Sunday, and we ended up talking for 3 hours at my kitchen table. Alicia poured more coffee and mentioned she'd been wanting to have this conversation for months. She explained that she and Joanne had noticed Brandon's controlling behavior getting worse over the past year, but didn't know how to bring it up without seeming like they were trying to sabotage my relationship. Joanne added that she'd watched me become quieter and more withdrawn at family gatherings, always checking my phone to see if Brandon had texted about what time I'd be home. They'd discussed it between themselves multiple times, but worried that saying something would damage our relationship if I wasn't ready to hear it. I felt this wave of relief knowing they'd seen what I'd been trying to ignore for so long. We made a pact right there to be honest with each other even when it felt uncomfortable, promising to speak up if we ever noticed concerning patterns in each other's relationships or lives. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, and we spent the rest of the morning laughing about childhood memories and making plans for a sister's trip next summer. Walking them to the door afterward, I felt closer to them than I had in years. Brandon's parents' final check arrived in the mail on Tuesday with a handwritten note attached. His mother had written that they were deeply ashamed of their son's behavior and grateful I'd handled everything with such grace and maturity. The check covered the last of the stolen money plus an additional $2,000 as interest and apology. I deposited it that afternoon and immediately opened my laptop to research the Iceland vacation I'd been dreaming about since college. Brandon had always dismissed the idea as too expensive and impractical, insisting we should save for a down payment on a bigger house instead. I booked a week-long trip for late spring with hiking tours and northern lights viewing, and felt this incredible rush of excitement about doing something purely for myself. The travel agent confirmed everything over email, and I printed out the itinerary to stick on my fridge as a daily reminder that my life was finally my own again. 4 months after finding Brandon and Megan in my bed, Etienne and I made things official over dinner at his apartment. He'd cooked this amazing French meal his grandmother had taught him, and we spent the evening talking about what we wanted from a relationship. The difference between him and Brandon felt overwhelming in the best way possible. Etienne asked about my career goals and seemed genuinely excited when I mentioned wanting to eventually start my own consulting firm. He shared his dreams of opening a creative agency, and we brainstormed ways we could support each other's ambitions, without either of us having to shrink our plans. He never once suggested I should change my appearance or eating habits or friend group. When I mentioned feeling nervous about jumping into something new so soon after my engagement ended, he squeezed my hand and said we could move at whatever pace felt comfortable. I realized I'd never felt like I was accommodating someone else's ego or walking on eggshells around his moods. Everything felt balanced and respectful in a way I hadn't experienced before. Holden called me into his office the following Monday morning with this huge smile on his face. He closed the door and told me the senior marketing director position was mine if I wanted it, along with a 40% salary increase and my own team of 5 people. I actually had to sit down because the news felt so surreal after years of Brandon pressuring me to quit and support his influencer plans instead. My new role would start next month and include leading the strategy for our 3 biggest client accounts. Holden mentioned that my work on the recent campaign had impressed the executive team, and they'd specifically requested me for the promotion. I accepted immediately and floated back to my desk feeling like everything was finally falling into place. My team took me out for celebratory drinks after work, and I found myself surrounded by colleagues who'd become genuine friends now that I wasn't isolating myself to avoid Brandon's jealousy and criticism. They shared stories about how much happier I seemed over the past few months, and how my energy had completely shifted since the breakup. My mom stopped by my townhouse that Wednesday evening with takeout, and we ate on my couch while watching trashy reality TV. During a commercial break, she mentioned she'd started seeing a therapist to work on her own issues with control and appearances. She admitted that her obsession with my wedding had been more about fulfilling her own dreams than supporting what I actually wanted. The therapist had helped her recognize patterns from her own mother and how she'd been repeating the same pressure and expectations with me. She apologized for the intervention and for not listening when I'd tried to express doubts about Brandon over the past year. I hugged her and told her I appreciated her willingness to examine her own behavior and make changes. She asked about Etienne and actually listened when I described our relationship without immediately planning our future wedding or pushing for grandchildren. The conversation felt more authentic than any we'd had in years, and I went to bed that night feeling grateful for her growth and our evolving relationship. My flight to Iceland left early on a Thursday morning in late April, and I spent the entire week hiking through volcanic landscapes and soaking in hot springs. I'd signed up for a solo traveler tour group and met people from 6 different countries who were all exploring on their own. We hiked to waterfalls and black sand beaches during the day and chased the northern lights at night. One evening, I stood alone on a cliff overlooking the ocean and felt this profound sense of peace about who I was outside of any relationship or anyone else's expectations. I'd spent so many years trying to be what Brandon wanted, or what my mom envisioned, that I'd lost touch with my own desires and dreams. The week felt like shedding an old skin and rediscovering the person I'd been before I'd started shrinking myself to fit someone else's vision. I returned home with hundreds of photos and this bone-deep confidence about my independence and future that I'd never experienced before. 6 months after that afternoon, I'd come home early and found Brandon with Megan. I was sitting in my newly decorated townhouse looking at my life with genuine amazement. My career was thriving with the promotion, and my own team who respected my leadership. Etienne and I had built this healthy relationship based on mutual support and respect, rather than control and accommodation. My mom and sisters and I had developed more authentic connections after our honest conversations about boundaries and communication. I'd taken the solo vacation I'd dreamed about for years, and returned feeling completely confident in who I was on my own. That moment of uncontrollable laughter when I'd caught them together hadn't been a breakdown like everyone thought. It had been the sound of relief and freedom breaking through years of suppressed doubts and growing resentment. I was grateful every single day that I'd trusted my instincts and walked away from a life that would have slowly suffocated everything authentic about me. Brandon had actually done me the biggest favor by getting caught because it gave me the exit I'd been too afraid to take on my own.